Hello and welcome to week 5 of the Philosophy of Mind course. My name is Dr. Richard Brown, and this week we're going to be discussing the relationship of intentionality, perception, and consciousness. And the question that we're going to be addressing is it possible for us to understand um, the nature of consciousness in terms of something that's more fundamental? And intentionality has often been turned to in this respect. So this marks one of the most central divisions in approaches to the philosophy of mind. So you may remember from our previous discussions that intentionality is the property that the mind has of representing or being about the world. And the consciousness, the problem of consciousness is the problem of phenomenal consciousness as distinguished from any other kinds of consciousness, whatever else they are called. And by phenomenal consciousness, we mean subjective character of experience, the fact that there's something that it's like for the organism or creature in question. And then also the phenomenal character, so the thing that's different between a conscious experience of red or a conscious experience of hearing a trumpet. And then, of course, we also think about bats, and they have a subjective character to their experience or something that it's like to be a bat. They're conscious. But the phenomenal character of a bat's experience is the particular way that it is like for a bat to do its batty stuff. Um, is a different question. That's what we talked about last week, whether we could understand that in terms of something more basic. So uh, people have sometimes thought that, well, look, you can't understand that in something more basic. These people think that phenomenal consciousness, subjective character, phenomenal character, that these things are just, they might be related to intentionality in an interesting way, but that ultimately they're just different, distinct from intentionality. And then there are the people on the other side who think that phenomenal consciousness is ultimately going to be explainable in terms of intentionality or this aboutness or some kind of representation or something like that. And roughly speaking, there are two kinds of representational theories that are what's called first order and higher order theories. Uh, and we're going to talk about this distinction between first order theories and higher order theories. But you should first of all be aware that it's a little bit misleading because what's at stake here is sort of cuts across the issue of first order and second order. Because Bloch, who we talked about last week, and who the current use of the word phenomenal consciousness, there's a lot, he's a big proponent of the idea that phenomenal consciousness is a first order phenomenon, and we'll say what the difference between first order and higher order phenomenon are in a second, phenomena, excuse me. Um, but he denies very strongly that that's all that there is to phenomenal consciousness, or that phenomenal consciousness can be somehow cashed out in terms of intentionality. So for someone like Bloch, he introduces the term mental paint, and he uses an analogy to the way pigments and paints work on a canvas. And I think he thinks that for the most part, this is a pretty accurate analogy. So to get us in the mood here, think about a map. So a map of, say, New York City shows you where the Empire State Building is by having some ink arranged in a certain way on the paper. And that ink has certain colors, like a color property. So, and there's various ways of doing this. So you can go get a map and study it, or a subway map, and so forth and so on. And so it's true that that little red mark, or that little yellow mark right there, has some intentional content. It represents, 42nd Street and the intersection of Fifth Avenue, or something like that. And So there's an intentional property that's associated with this color red on the map. But the color itself doesn't have that intentional property. It can be used and it can come to have that property, being directed about or something like that. But Ned Block thinks that, well, the color itself is not intentional. It's just a color. It's just a certain way that it's like, certain yellowness to the experience. So now that's a first order view, because it's the claim is that this property exists without anyone being aware of it. And this awareness of relation is going to be important for this distinction. But the point is that that kind of view is very different from other first order theorists like Fred Dretske, who we'll look at his view in a second. But Dretske wants to argue that phenomenal consciousness just is intentional states. That the more fundamental feature here is intentionality, representation in particular, and that consciousness, the phenomenal consciousness in particular, just turns out to be a kind of representation or intentional state. So that's what we're going to look at now. Why is this a first order distinction here? Well, according to Dretske, a phenomenally conscious state is one that's directed at the world. It represents the world that we're in. So if you have a phenomenally, if you have a phenomenal experience of red, an experience of phenomenal red, like you're seeing, consciously experiencing red, then Dretske claims that that represents the world. It represents the world as having red in it. And that's why this is an intentional theory, because the claim is that what consciousness is simply representing the world as being a certain way. Now, traditionally, people have sort of appealed to three basic things in support of first order representational theories. And we're going to turn to in a second, looking at from the alternative point of view, the higher order point of view, which claims that instead of the conscious state being world directed, you have to have a higher order awareness of that world directed state. That's why it's higher order. We'll get to that in a second, though. So one of the arguments that's usually given for first order theories is one we've discussed already, and that's we discussed this in the perception section when we were talking about direct realism and whether we have some kind of veil of perception or some mental thing that stands in between us and the world. And one argument for a kind of directness is transparency. And here it's being used to argue for a first order theory. And often it's used to show that we're not really aware of our own mental state. So people will say things like, look, if you want to, suppose you're looking at a red apple and you want to focus on not the apple and the apple being red, but you want to focus on your experience of the redness. Well, what do you do in that case? Well, I don't know about you, but the only thing that occurs to me is to sort of look at the apple. And, well, the apple's an object, right? So how is that an experience? It doesn't seem like when I'm really trying to focus, I can't find the experience itself. I find just the object and the way that the object is. So that's the argument from transparency. Now, of course, the sort of obvious objection to this argument is that while it may be hard and not ordinary to isolate the experience, it seems with training we can do it. People can be trained to reflect on their experience rather than on the objects. But this may be something we want to discuss in class, whether you think the argument from transparency shows that really we don't have an awareness of a mental experience of red, but rather a direct kind of awareness of the object itself. Now, another argument, and this one is very popular, and I think it carries some weight, so I think we have to take this argument seriously. The idea here is that, well, we want to think, when we say that we see red, well, normally we expect the world to be a certain way, that there be something out there that's red. And sometimes you have those kinds of experiences and they're wrong. And that's, dreaming and hallucinations and illusions. And we talked about that in the perception section as well. So here the idea is that, well, look, why should you think that conscious experience is a representation or has some kind of representational or intentional content? The answer comes back, well, because the experience represents the world as being a certain way. It puts an accuracy condition on the world. In other words, if you are looking at a red apple, then the experience represents the world as being a certain way, and it's accurate if the world is that way. It's inaccurate if the world isn't that way. So if it's really, you know, um, a white apple, I'm trying to think of why it's white on the fly, but I don't know, it's been bleached. So if it's really a white apple that's having a red light shown on it, then that's not the same as an apple which really is red and what you're perceiving. So in both cases, they look the same, and you might want to say they have the same content or similar content. They represent the world the same way, maybe, but in one there's accuracy, and in the other there's inaccuracy. So this has led many people to believe that there is some kind of content or representation or intentional aspect to conscious mental states. Now, one problem with this, as we've seen previously, is that, well, okay, so that just means that maybe there's some kind of representation in the mind. It doesn't show that that's what phenomenal consciousness is. And so we're going to get back to this when we look at the higher order perspective, because they'll make a point about this. Now, this is sort of a more technical point, but people make this point a lot, and it's in one of the papers we're reading in class, so we may as well bring it up so that if someone's confused, they can at least ask for it, ask about it. So this is what's sometimes called the argument from seeming. And seemings are weird things. So, the way things seem to you is not always the way things are. And that's, of course, the way we would commonsensically describe a hallucination or an illusion, that it seems as though there's a red apple that you're reaching for, but really there isn't. You're just hallucinating that there's a red apple. So the way things seem to you is closely associated with conscious experience, because what it's like to be you is tied up with the way things seem from your point of view, right? So that these two things seem uh, related to each other, although clearly there are other ways of using the word seem, and this is something that is being played upon here, because you can also say that when something seems a certain way, that you believe it to be that way or represent it to be that way. So that we say, well, it seems to me that if 2 plus 2 is 4, then it should be the case that 4 minus 2 is 2. That's a kind of intellectual seeming. You say, well, okay, well, if that's the way addition works, then this should follow from that. Or we say, seems to me my car is on the street, and what you mean is that you believe that your car is on the street. So we sometimes use the word in different ways, and representationalists will often point out that if you change a representation, you change the way things seem to you. So, for instance, if you have a visual state which represents the world as being green, and you change that so that it represents the world as being red, well, then it seems intuitively that the way things seem to you will change, so that seemings and representation seem closely linked together. That's the argument from seeming. Now, all of these, drinking my tea here, all of these first order theories suffer from a kind of well-known objection. The well-known objection is that it seems like you could have all those kinds of things and yet the thing in question not be conscious. So there seems to be unconscious mental states, and they seem to occur, they seem to be mental, they seem to have the normal properties of mental states and affect our behavior, and yet we don't seem to be aware of them. But yet they still do show up in our behavior. Now, the common sense example of this is when you're sort of multitasking. You may be driving or walking, and you may be talking with someone or thinking about something, and not really aware of all of the obstacles in your way. Like, a car in front of you or a person who's suddenly stopping in front of you. And you may be too focused on the conversation, the point you're trying to make. No, no, this is the point about consciousness. I'm trying to say this. And meanwhile, you're not running into stuff, though. You're skillfully avoiding objects in your environment. Now, of course, sometimes it doesn't go as planned and you'll bump or fall, but for the most part, we're pretty good at doing this. And, this was a common thing. A philosopher, David Armstrong, first brought this out, to my attention anyway, in a paper of his where he talked about the long distance truck driver. And he says, okay, these guys that drive, and this relates I relate to this because coming from California and driving on the 5, you have long stretches of highway that are very boring, and you're traveling, pretty fast, 85, 90 miles an hour sometimes to keep up with traffic. And it doesn't even feel like you're going that fast. You may be singing a song, talking to a friend. Next thing you know, 100 miles have gone by. And yeah, I guess I was aware of the road and the obstacles and the cars, and I didn't crash into anything, but I was not consciously aware of them. I didn't experience myself as being aware of them. And that seems common sense, right? That's just a common sense kind of thing, which seems to happen to us every day, that we have these complex behaviors that need visual input and mental representations, all the kinds of things that we were just talking about. There's accuracy conditions. If you represent the car as being going faster than it is, you'll hit something. So clearly there's, the kinds of things we were just talking about seem relevant, but it seems I'm doing it and there's nothing that it's like for me. It's not conscious. Now, moving from common sense to more psychological cases, we can talk about subliminal perception. And subliminal perception is one of these things that has a perfectly ordinary scientific meaning, but then also a pseudo weird pop culture meaning. And we want to make sure that we distinguish these two things. So on the one hand, we've all heard stories probably about the old days when, they would put subliminal advertisements in film, and you'd watch the movie and there'd be a Coke image, a Coca-Cola image every 14th frame or something. And, I remember as a kid hearing a story about the Exorcist films, often dubbed the most frightening movie of all time. And it's pretty scary. And I heard a rumor that it was because they had these scary faces cut into the film sequences every 1,000 frames or so. There would be a flash of a face, and allegedly it was supposed to be perceived subliminally and frighten you. And who knows if that's true? I mean, I think that's an urban legend, but the point is that you hear these stories about subliminal advertising and how effective it is, and for the most part, as far as I can tell, a lot of it's exaggerated. So I'm not really sure. I'm not an expert on that. But in the psychological sciences, subliminal perception is studied. It just means the perception of things below the subjective threshold. So you can present things in a certain way and then ask a person if they saw it or not, and they will tell you that they didn't. And there are various methods that people can do to render the stimulus subliminal. One method is presenting it very quickly. Another method is what's called backwards masking, where you present the stimulus quickly, and then another stimulus that somehow blocks you from perceiving the first one. And that's a technique which is used. That's masking is what it's called. And there are other techniques as well. So scientists study this kind of stuff, and one thing that they have discovered is what's called a priming effect. So this is a very interesting kind of piece of evidence. Now, there is a lot of empirical data on this, and I'm not going to go through a lot of experimental evidence right now, but I'll just try to explain the gist of the idea, and we can talk about specific cases in class if you want to. So a priming effect is when you're presented with something, and that helps you do something else later on a little bit quicker. So psychologists are often interested in how quickly you can respond to something, and that's called reaction time. And they'll measure how long it takes you to answer a question, push a button, or something like that. And there are well-known cases where you get reaction time interferences. So one of them is called the Stroop effect. So if you present the word red spelled out, R-E-D, in normal black letters, and you're having people push buttons indicating something, that doesn't do anything. But if you spell the letter in green, spell the word in green font, so it says R-E-D, but it's green R, green E, green D, and it spells red though. And you're asking people to name the color. It turns out it takes them longer to name the word because they see the color green and they immediately want to say green, green, green. And so the color somehow that they visually perceive interferes with their accessing the conceptual or content of the word, the meaning, excuse me, that's a long-winded way of saying the meaning of the word, which they're looking at, which is red, even though they're seeing the color green. So that's called the Stroop effect, and people study this. So that, now, one interesting thing is you can do this thing subliminally. So you present like these kinds of cases where people say they see nothing, but what the stimulus that you actually exposed them to was this thing that I just described. It was the word R-E-D, but spelled with green font. So the subjects say, I didn't see anything, but then if you ask them to name something, like if you then show them the word red, and ask them just to read it, like what? It's harder. It takes them longer. Why? Well, because earlier the green thing was activated and they're getting the interference that you would expect, but because of the subliminal thing earlier. And there are other kinds of effects like this as well. Some of, really quickly, there are cases where you can present people with certain incomplete word stems, like the letters O-P, and then you can complete that with a letter M and make mop, or you can complete it with the letter T and make top, or you can complete it with a letter C and make cop. And so you get the idea that it's just a word stem and you can complete it in different ways. Now, if you show people subliminally a picture of a policeman, but they report not seeing anything, and then you ask them to do this word stem completion thing, they're more likely to say cop. Why? Well, because they just saw the picture of the cop, but they didn't see it consciously. They saw it unconsciously, so they weren't aware that they saw it, and they report that there was nothing that it was like for them to see it. So from their point of view, they just didn't have any conscious experience. But yet this stuff shows up and has some effect in their behavior. There's the Stroop effect, delay. There's the completion things, and there are other cases too where you get enhancement of performance. So the inference then that a lot of researchers make is that, well, there's a mental representation here that has some intentional content, but you're not aware of it, and phenomenal consciousness doesn't seem to be going on because you say, I don't have any conscious experience. So therefore that seems like an objection to first order theories. And to be honest, I think that's a pretty serious objection to first order theories. And I'd be interested to hear from anyone what they think possible solutions from a first order point of view might be, because to be honest, I find this pretty convincing. Okay, but that doesn't mean that it's right. It just means that it's a challenge that I think has to be met. And then I'll also just mention some stuff we talked about last week, and that's the blind sight. And then I'll add another thing here called neglect. And if you weren't watching the previous video, blind sight is a very interesting case of a neurological phenomenon discovered that puzzled people. And basically what happens is you have some kind of damage to your primary visual cortex, like the beginning of it, of areas V1, if you know some lingo. And we're going to do some neural stuff later, 2 weeks from now, actually. So I'll come back to that kind of stuff. But the basic idea, and in very bad cases, you have almost all of it damaged or removed. And then there are also partial damages and so forth and so on. So now you would expect that someone who had the visual part of their brain, the primary area of that damaged, you would expect that they wouldn't be able to see. And in fact, these people report that they don't have conscious experience. They say, I don't see anything. But if you test them, like push a button or tell me if this is an X or a circle, or if it's green, or if it's red, or if it's moving, or stationary, and there's some other things they can do too, then they're able to do it, and they're able to do it surprisingly well. So the information is in there, and it's being accessed somehow. If you force them to access it, they can. Um, so now that seems like there's some representations around, and that these representations have intentional content, but no phenomenal consciousness. Now, neglect is a similar kind of case. It also happens as a result of brain damage. Uh, and these people usually just say that they don't see anything, like a certain half of the visual field is just missing for them. So they may, if you say draw what you see, they draw only the right side of things, and they just ignore the left side of things. If you put, if they're thirsty and you put a glass of water on their left side, and you say, is there anything around here that you would like to drink? They'll say no, because they say they just, somehow the stuff on that side of the visual field is not being attended to or represented. We're not sure what the right way to describe that is, but they say they don't see anything there. They say there's no conscious experience of the thing there. Now you say, that's interesting. And here's the thing, though. Suppose that you present them with a picture, and I should have put a picture of this on the slides now that I think about this, because you can find this online. But you can Google this and check it out. You can present them with a picture where it's a picture of a house, and the right side of the house looks normal, and the left side of the house is on fire. Okay? So suppose that this person has a neglect to the left side of the visual field. So if you do it right, you'll get it to where they say, nothing. You ask them, does anything look unusual about this house? They say no. It looks normal. And if you ask them to draw, they draw the right side of the house, and they draw only the normal things. So nothing about this fire stuff. But if you say, so this is a nice house, they say, yeah, it looks very nice. They say, well, okay, so would you like to live in this house? And surprisingly, they say, no, I wouldn't want to go into that house. You say, oh, that's interesting. And why? Oh, I don't know. It doesn't look right. It's dirty, maybe. And so they, the interesting thing is, why wouldn't they want to go in the house? I mean, obviously, it's like a picture of a house, so it's not real. But the hypothesis is, well, they must somehow represent the fact that it's on fire, and they must have that information, or that somehow that must be relevant to their behavior, even though they say, and if you take their expressions at face value, then we have reason to believe that they don't consciously experience that part of the visual field. So these are three kinds of cases. Common sense, subliminal perception from priming effects, and blindsight and neglect type clinical cases. And it seems like then overall we have a pretty convincing case that mental states occur unconsciously, and that when they do, there's no phenomenal consciousness. Now, this has led some people to think, aha, you see, higher order awareness is involved, and importantly involved in phenomenal consciousness. So now, what is higher order awareness? Well, we've been using this distinction roughly as follows: that a first order state is one that represents the external world. Maybe the state of your body can count as the external world. So that if it represents that there's tissue damage on your arm, that can count as a state of the external world, at least for right now, unless someone wants to object. But let's say that. So that's world directed. And then you can have representations that are not world directed, but that are other representation directed. A state is higher order if it's about another mental representation. So we can have higher order perception, which you might think of as perceiving your own perception or perceiving your own mental state. And you can also have thinking. So you have higher order thinking about desires, beliefs, etc. And you have crossovers here. So you can have maybe higher order perception about your thinking, your first order thinking. You could have higher order thinking about your first order sensing. And so this is a general distinction, as long as you recognize that it simply means in the one case, you're representing the external world, and in the other case, you're representing something mental, the internal world. That's the general distinction. Now, and that's just a general distinction, like I just said. It's not, nothing fancy has gone on so far. Whatever theory of consciousness you ultimately opt for, people recognize the distinction between representing the world and representing your thinking or perceiving of the world. Now, the higher order theories of consciousness think there's something interesting here. And they go, look, okay, maybe what this data that we've just been talking about show or suggest is that when you are in no way aware or conscious of yourself as being in these mental states, then from your point of view, it's just like they don't exist. And so there's nothing that it's like for you. And when you are aware of them, then that somehow makes it the case that there's something that it's like for you to have them. It makes you aware that they're there. So perhaps an unconscious mental state is one that I am unaware of. And sensing and thinking seem to be our only two known forms of awareness. So higher order theories of consciousness have sort of branched into those that claim higher order perception is the important faculty, an inner sense, if you like that term. And other people have claimed that it's thinking, that higher order thought or higher order intentional states are important. And historically, we can look back, and this had kind of a long tradition in philosophy. So higher order perception traces back at least to John Locke. And Locke's, you know, Locke, I'm actually forgetting when Locke was writing. I think in the 1680s or maybe early 1700s. I don't know. I shouldn't have brought dates into this nice discussion of ours. But Locke is, a modern philosopher. And here's a quote from his work on this. Consciousness is the perception of what passes in a person's own mind. So Locke seems to at least have taken the view that consciousness, if by consciousness here he means phenomenal consciousness, which I don't know if he does or not. I think probably he does if you get down to it. But people have interpreted this as the claim that it's higher order perception is important, and I think that's kind of an intuitive view. And the higher order thought view that really it's not perception but higher order thinking that is important seems to trace its way back to Kant. And so Kant says in the Critique, the I think must be able to accompany all my representations, for otherwise something would be represented in me that could not be thought at all, which is as much to say that the representation would either be impossible or at least would be nothing to me. And so people sometimes think, aha, you see this, maybe Kant's idea is that whenever sensory representations we have, when they're conscious, that simply means that you attach the I think to it. I think I'm in this state, so that there's this kind of higher order thinking about the state that turns it into a conscious state or is importantly involved in it being a conscious state. So those are higher order theories of consciousness. And they split and they argue amongst themselves. Is it perception? Is it thinking? And we're not really going to go into that debate. That's a more complicated debate. But let's just generally think about this situation here. So each of these theories are trying to account for consciousness in terms of intentionality. First order theories think that the intentionality is the world-directed kind of intentionality. Higher order theories of consciousness think that it's the kind of inner directed intentionality. But in both, it's representations and intentionality that are doing the explanatory work. And for thoughts and propositional attitudes, this explanatory role seems adequate, seems great. Something very commonsensical about the idea that an unconscious thought is one that you're simply unaware of yourself as having. So, if you have the unconscious belief that the earth is a cube, then it seems normal and obvious to say what that means is you have this kind of mental representation, which is, and I mean, if it's manifesting in your behavior at the time, whether it's dispositional or not, remember, let's put that aside. So this is a current mental episode, I believe. If that's what's happening, then it makes sense to say, yes, you have some kind of mental state that you're simply not aware of yourself as being in, and that's all there is to having an unconscious desire or thought or belief. or wondering or any of those kinds of things. Now, phenomenal consciousness usually is thought to be something special about sensory states, like seeing red and feeling pain. Uh, and then there's a whole separate issue about whether there's something like that going on with the propositional attitudes. And I'm sort of sidestepping that here because maybe it's a bit too abstract at this point to see what it is. Although, just since I brought it up, my personal view is that it's common sense that there's something that it's like for you to have a thought, think a thought, or to remember something. That's a different issue, though. So higher order theories of consciousness say something stronger. Not only is this true of thoughts, that an unconscious thought is one you're not aware of, they claim that's what phenomenal consciousness is. That what it is to have subjective character and phenomenal character is simply to be aware of yourself as having various other first order states. Now, what this means then is that these, just like we said, unconscious perception, there's nothing that it's like for you to have it. And in fact, remember, if you recall from a few slides ago, it seems as though that was common sense. That when you're sitting there, if the subject says, look, I don't see anything, then it's why think that they are lying or wrong? I mean, whether they are lying or wrong is a deep philosophical issue, but at first start, doesn't seem like there's any good reason to insist that they're wrong about that. If the person says, look, I don't see anything, there's nothing that it's like for me to see that, except for that it's like seeing nothing. And then for us to insist, no, you're wrong. There is something that it's like for you. So this is supposed to be kind of commonsensical on one level, but it's also supposed to be a little bit mysterious what's going on here. So what needs to happen on higher order theories, and this is what you see people who take this approach do, and in our example, it's David Rosenthal, who's the higher order theorist that we're looking at here. And so you make a distinction between phenomenal character, what it's like for you to see red, and the qualitative property. And often, to be honest with you, everyone in the world usually uses these two terms to mean the same thing. So the higher order theorist has to kind of co-opt this term, and that's just the way things are. The terminology is very messy. See, Frankie agrees. She's very angry about the terminology being so messy. So we'll just, even though most people will use these terms interchangeably, we can stipulate a definition. So a qualitative property then on this view, like the qualitative property of mental red, is the first order state that represents the world as being red. And the claim here is that when you're not aware of having that kind of state, then there's no phenomenal consciousness of red. There's just this first order state that is representing things. And by the way, which will account later for various effects in your behavior, like Stroop effects and blah, 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 but which at the time that it occurs is not phenomenally conscious. And then they go on to claim that in order for the phenomenal consciousness, the experience of the thing in the normal sense of that word, to come online, you need to be aware of yourself, now either by thought or perception, who knows, but somehow some kind of higher order awareness of the representation of the external world needs to occur before there's anything that it's like for you. So that what it's like for you to be in pain is simply to be aware of yourself as being in pain. And when the pain occurs and you don't have that higher awareness, the claim is nothing that it's like for you. And that sounds a bit weird. How could you have a pain that didn't feel painful? Well, I always tell a story at this point from my own personal experience because I think it illustrates this point very well. And it's when I was a child, when I was very young, me and my sister were walking along the beach where I grew up in California. And my mom was there too, by the way. So we weren't just randomly wandering around. But anyway, I saw my sister was limping. And I said to her, why are you limping? What's the matter? And she said, I'm not limping. Nothing's wrong. And I said, well, look, clearly you're limping. So she was limping. She stopped and was like, looked at her foot and saw that she had stepped on a bee and the stinger was stuck into her foot. And she saw that and immediately started screaming, crying, it hurts, it hurts. Now think about what happened before she saw the bee. she was walking along talking to my mom. If you had said to her, "Are you in pain?" She would have said no. Said, "You're limping." She said, "No, I'm not limping." So is it really that odd to think that at that time she had a pain, that there was literal some kind of representation of the tissue damage caused by the stinger, and that that was affecting her behavior, causing her to limp and favor that foot, but that there was no painfulness, nothing that it was like for her to experience the pain? I don't think that that is very odd. I think actually that fits perfectly with this kind of experience. And you can think for yourself whether you've ever had a headache or a backache or some kind of pain that has lasted for a while and which you didn't notice for some point, like maybe your ankle hurt, and at one point during the day you're texting your friend or playing doodle jump or something, and lo and behold, during that time the ankle hurting didn't seem to be around, and then all of a sudden oh, there it is again. So, and it seems as though it's the same pain through the whole thing. It's just at some point it wasn't there, you weren't aware of it, and so it wasn't painful for you. Now what's nice about this, says the higher order theorist, is that it gives us a explanation of the phenomenal consciousness stuff we like. So on the one hand, we have the subjective character. Well, they say, look, that's the subjective character is the fact that there's something that it's like at all, and which all conscious experiences will have in common, no matter how weird and different they are. And the higher order theorist says, yeah, that's great. What that is higher order awareness. So that even in the bat going to have higher order awareness of its own states if it has conscious states. And even in the aliens, if there's something that it's like to be the alien, that's because they're having this kind of higher order representation of their own mental life. So subjective character on this view is explainable in terms of the fact that it's us being aware of this stuff. So yes, it's presented to me in a certain kind of way. That's why there's something that it's like for me. Now, why is it like this as opposed to like that? Well, that's because the things that are represented are different. So if I'm representing myself as seeing red, then what it's like for me is like seeing red. If I represent myself as having weird alien bad experiences, then that's going to be different. So many people have thought, see, higher order theories have an advantage here. They're able to explain the difference between a conscious mental state and an unconscious mental state in terms of whether there's higher order awareness or not. And not only that, and that doesn't seem, by the way, very easily accomplished on the first order view. But not only that, the view fits perfectly with this idea that there's a subjective component, and then also a subjective component which is the same between all conscious experiences, the higher order awareness, and the phenomenal component, which is the particular way that you're aware of the experience, the way that it's presented to you. So that's very nice. Now, some people have thought there's a problem with this higher order view. And what I want to do now is present an argument which was originally presented by Fred Dretske, the argument from change blindness. And so this is a figure from a scientific paper. And the paper is by Fernandez Duque et al. And it doesn't really matter what the particular paper is for this purpose, because this kind of represents a general approach to doing this kind of work. So what you see here are what would be presented to a person in this experiment. So you go in, you sit down, and first you see this screen. It's a computer screen, and the screen has a cross in the middle. You see that on the left-hand side. And then around the cross are these rectangles, geometrical figures presented in basically like a clock-like formation. And the George and not George you see there, that's there for a reason, but it wouldn't be in the experiment. I'm just going to put it there because I want to talk about those two rectangles. And it will be useful for us to keep track of the fact that George is the horizontally oriented rectangle, and that not George is the vertical one. Okay, so what happens in this case? You sit down, they tell you to stare at the screen for 250 milliseconds. And then it goes away, and you see the blank screen in the middle for 250 milliseconds. And by the way, you can vary how long and blah, blah, blah. After that, they present the next screen, the third thing there. The arrow on the bottom indicates that it's one after the other. for that exact amount of time. Now, either the final slide that they see will be the same as the first one, so the final one will have George, or the final one will have not George. And what subjects are required to do is to report, so that one will be circled, for instance, singled out, and then they'll ask them, is that the same shape that was there before? And you say yes or no. So you have to report, basically, whether you saw the change. Now, it turns out that subjects don't do this. They're bad at it. So they if you do it right, they're at chance as to whether or not they get it right when they say that it's the same or different. But if you do this right, it turns out that there's priming effect. So they must have been sensitive to the change and they must have represented it at some level. So that's what's going on here, right? We have some evidence that you see everything there in both cases, but you fail to detect this difference. Now, that's interesting. Now, here's Dretski's point. So this is Fred Dretsky, and he says, look, this is interesting because subjects in these experiments are not conscious of the difference, but they have a conscious experience of the whole scene. And you can prove that or not prove it, but you can support the idea that they have all the information there because there are these priming effects. And if Dretsky is right, then when they consciously experience not George in the third slide there, they're not aware of not George as being different. So they're not conscious of that experience, says Dretsky. Therefore, they have a conscious experience that represents the way the stimulus is, not George. But they're not aware of that. And therefore, we have phenomenally conscious experience without higher order awareness. Now, I think that this is a very interesting argument, the argument from change blindness against higher order theories. I also happen to think that there's a pretty good response that can be given. And so this is the response that David Rosenthal has developed, and we'll just rehearse it here. But it seems as though we can be aware of things in some respects, but not others. To take an example from perception, you can perceive an object, and when you're aware of the object, you'll be aware of like just the front of it. And well, I don't know, are you aware of the back side of the object, the side that you can't see, the underside of it? So you can be aware of it in some respects, maybe not in other respects. You can think about something in some respects and not other respects. So it seems okay to say that awareness allows us this kind of latitude. And so what Rosenthal does, and this again, we're reading his paper in this section, so it's good to bring this up here. What Rosenthal does is to argue as follows. Look, you're aware of the different rectangle. And by aware of, that's a first order awareness. There's a first order representation of the rectangle in a different orientation. And you can see that because there's priming effects and other reasons to believe that. But the way that you're aware of that rectangle, Rosenthal continues, is just as being another shape on the thing orientated in a certain direction. Your higher order awareness doesn't tag that one as being different than the other one, and you don't experience it as being different. So there is no first order experience that you're not aware of, Rosenthal says. You're aware of the whole experience, just not of it as being the thing that's different, not aware of the difference. Okay? And this again is the same kind of response that you would give to Bloch's jackhammer example. If you remember from our last discussion, when we were setting up these issues, Bloch thinks that you can have phenomenal consciousness without any kind of intentionality or awareness in the kinds of cases where you hear a noise coming from outside and it's going on and on and on, but then you're thinking about something else and it sort of disappears into the background and fades out, and then suddenly you focus back on it and you go, oh yeah, that was going on the whole time, and you sort of realize or seem to think or experience it as being a continuous thing that you sort of zoned out on for a second, but that was still humming in the background. And Ned thinks that, Block thinks that okay, that's, phenomenal consciousness, but no higher order awareness. But of course, Rosenthal can give this kind of response. No, you're still aware of it the entire time, but aware of it as being in the background, as being secondary, as not being at the center of your attention. And later on, you become aware of it as sort of, in the forefront, and as having continued even before. So the higher order awareness captures the way the experience seems to you, the way it's presented to you. So Rosenthal thinks that this is actually truer to the phenomenology of the experience. It's a very interesting response. So now that was an argument which was supposed to, the argument from change blindness is supposed to show that there's a problem with higher order theories. And what I think was come out is that what we've seen is, well, it shows how flexible the theory is and how it actually lines up very nicely with phenomenology. And you might think, well, okay, so how could higher order anything, awareness, involve or make phenomenal consciousness? How could that be what it really is? And so Rosenthal thinks that these are intentional thought-like states, and instead of more perceptual-like, he thinks that they're actually like thoughts in being intentional and employing concepts. And one of his arguments, which I think is interesting for us to discuss at this point, is the argument from concept acquisition. So here's the case, and I think it's interesting he points this out. By the time you get to be an adult, you've learned most of the words that you're going to learn and acquired most of the concepts that you're going to acquire. And so really to do this, it would be better to go back when you didn't know a lot of stuff and you were like 6 or 7 or however 5 or whatever the age is when you start acquiring a lot of this stuff, and see if there's a difference in the way, kids aren't thinking about this, but you might want to train a kid in phenomenology and see as they learn all these new words and concepts, does their experience change? But even so, as adults, this does happen sometimes. And wine tasting and in music and in drinking whiskey and any kinds of things where you have to learn to focus on or think about your own experience in a more fine-grained way. So take the wine tasting case. So you drink some wine, you taste it, tastes good, tastes like wine, yum. And you drink a second wine and they taste the same. So then someone explains you the difference between them. One's oaky and the other one's not. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, let me taste them again. Taste, okay. See, you can pick out the difference now. There's a difference there. And you can now think, that's the oakiness. You're able to apply the concept to the first order state and thereby change what it's like for you. It seems oaky now. It didn't seem that way before, but now like you've picked out a new property of the first order state. And really there are two possibilities here, and this is kind of Rosenthal's point. So one is that the way you're aware of the first order sensory qualities determine what it's like. So on this view, you imagine that there's a first order state there that has all of those relevant properties. They're the same. And then you taste it and it's the same there, and it has all those properties, A, B, C, D, whatever. And then you learn about oakiness, and then you taste it again and it has the same properties. And then you realize, whereas earlier you were representing A, B, C, and D as one thing, now you recognize, oh, A and B are distinct from this thing. And so you've divided it up, even though they were all there before. But the way you were aware of them was just as one kind of thing. And now you sort of, you have the concepts which can distinguish the A part from the B part, the oakiness from the non-oakiness part. And so the first order state, according to Rosenthal, is the same. It was the same before, it's the same now. What's changed is you've acquired a new concept, which can be put into a thought about the first order sensory qualitative property, resulting in a change in phenomenal consciousness. Because the phenomenal character of your experience is determined by the content of your higher order awareness, which is now more conceptually rich. Now, that's the Rosenthal story. His challenge is, well, what's the other guy's story? So the other guy, he thinks, has to claim that, well, when you become aware of the wine taste, that you make something new there which wasn't there, that somehow the oakiness part of the experience gets generated by you thinking about it. And that seems weird. It seems weird to say that simply, having this kind of new ability to think these thoughts, apply new attentional concepts to your first order states. Uh, it seems strange to think that that's going to somehow generate a new phenomenal property, unless, in the first order state, a new like qualitative property of the first order state, which wasn't there previously. So now it turns into an empirical question, I guess, whether you can have cases where having the relevant higher order awareness somehow affects or changes the first order state. And there are some kinds of cases like this. Um, uh, Perhaps, this is the case of if you tell someone that they're going to be burned and then you put a piece of ice on their arm, they might experience it as hot for a second. And this might be because they expect it. And so maybe they generate the actual feeling of heat, even though what they're sensing is cold. Or maybe the higher order awareness changes it. So here's where the push and pull of the two views really comes into it. Now, Rosenthal is aware of this, and he's tried to mount an argument which shows that the higher order view gets it right and the other first order views don't. So this is a very interesting argument, and I hope we can talk about it, but it's based on something called dental fear, which happens in a certain percentage of cases among dental patients. So it's not a weird clinical case. It's not a weird brain damage case. This is normal people going to the dentist. And it often happens to be children. So when I did some research on this, I found articles in dental journals which were instructing dentists on how to deal with children who were having this kind of dental fear situation. So what is dental fear? Well, here it is. So you go into the dentist, you need some work done, like a cavity to be drilled and filled. And so they give you the Novocaine and anesthetizes the nerve. And what that means is that the tooth is no longer sending pain signals to the brain. So you cut off the communication between the tooth and the brain. And so the idea is supposed to be that there are no pain sensations being generated in the brain, because when you chip at the tooth, it sends the signal, but the signal has been turned off, so you don't get the pain. And in most cases, that's right. I'm sure we've all been to the dentist and you feel the Novocaine and they drill and it feels like you feel pressure and you feel them touching you, but you don't feel any pain. In most cases, that's the way it works. But in some cases, people who have this anesthesia report feeling pain. And then so they give you another shot of Novocaine, and then they let it sit in for a little bit, and then they go back to work. And sometimes people say, no, it still hurts. And if you've ever had that really intense pain of someone drilling into your tooth, it hurts a lot. So some people get, no, help. So they're in pain and they can't give them any more Novocaine. Sometimes they've given you as much as you can. So what are you supposed to do? Well, it turns out that often what happens, if you simply explain to the dental patient that they cannot be having a pain sensation, but are rather misinterpreting vibration from the drill, kind of vibrating, and the pressure of people pushing, the dentist pushing in order to drill into the tooth. So you are getting those sensations because those nerves haven't been damaged, or excuse me, not damaged, anesthetized. So you're getting sensations of pressure and vibration, and you explain to these people, oh, well, since you're sort of waiting for a pain signal, you're going to interpret this incoming message as painful, and so it's going to go pain. Now, that sounds like what's going on is that you have these sensations, and you're aware of them as being painful, And that makes it the case that what it's like for you is that it's painful. And then you get this explanation. And then you go back to being aware of them as being vibrations and pressure sensations. And it's no longer painful. And the thing is the same in both cases. It seems reasonable to conclude that there wasn't a pain around because the nerve has been blocked. And the only thing that looks like it's different is that in one case you were aware of that sensation as painful and you thereby report, ouch, it hurts. And in the other case, you were aware of that very same sensation, not as being painful, but merely being a sensation. And that seems to make a difference in what it's like for you. So Rosenthal likes to say, look, this supports my case that how we are aware of the first order experience determines what it's like for us. Now, again, the other side has typically responded, yeah. Or did you sort of have top-down creation of a pain? So this is a clever move by Rosenthal because what he's trying to show is a case where we don't have the pain sensation. Like there's no first order sensation of pain because the nerve has been blocked. But yet the people say I'm in pain. And so the higher awareness seems important. But some people have responded, look, how do we know that, maybe there's some kind of, you believe it or expect it so much because, you're afraid the fear might actually produce a first order sensation of pain. So it's true that the normal route whereby the pain is created, the pain sensation, is created by doing something to the tooth and that produces the sensation. Maybe it's created by your fear and expectation. And so maybe it's wrong to say that there's only the sensations of vibration and pressure and that you're aware of those as being painful. Maybe it's correct to say that in addition, there's this first order pain, which you've brought about in this unusual way. So this is a really interesting debate between these two theories of consciousness. And, we're not going to solve this question here, but we can think about it. And we can think about one particular thing that really is interesting to me is, well, what kind of experimental evidence would help us here? Like, what can we do an experiment that would get around this issue, which would really tell us whether or not phenomenal consciousness involved a higher order awareness or could be had in the absence of any kind of higher order awareness. And I'll leave that for discussion. Okay, so we're coming to the end here, and I'll just focus on one last issue here, which is the function of consciousness, because this has often been a battleground between these two theories. So many people think, look, consciousness is important for rationality, and in particular for inference and planning and so-called executive function, where you're control of behavior and stopping yourself from doing various things and finding memories. And there's all sorts of nice and important things that our prefrontal cortex does, which people call sort of executive function, and involve rational planning for the future and making vacation plans and graduating college and all that kind of fantastic stuff. And we know that if you damage those areas of the brain, that really messes up these kinds of executive functions. So some people think, animals can't do that. And so the more down you go the animal scale, the more like rigid their behaviors come, the more programmed in instinctual it looks like it gets. Whereas humans are not like that. We have all kinds of interesting adaptive behaviors we can come up with on the fly and on the spur of the moment, as it were. And people think, that maybe consciousness has something to do with that. Now, also, obviously, there's social interactions and a large part of communication, talking, like what I'm doing right now, trying to communicate something to you. People think, well, maybe that's consciousness is importantly involved with that. And so maybe, bacteria don't have that because they don't have consciousness. Who knows? And then finally, people think, well, creativity, like art and writing poems and stuff, you might have to have consciousness to do that. Now, the two theories of consciousness we've been looking at. I see that my final slide here had the animations timed wrongly, so there's everything. But I still could go through it. The battleground has been whether the higher order theories can really account for this kind of notion of the function of consciousness. And then the higher order response has been whether there really is something that we need to account for. So I think it's pretty clear that if you think about phenomenal consciousness as being a first order thing, then it has a lot of function, like, consciously perceiving red, being aware of red in the environment is an important thing. And, people postulate that color perception might have something to do with determining when fruits are ripe, for instance, and therefore when to eat them. And maybe telling the difference between a green banana and a yellow banana is an important thing to be able to do, because yellow bananas are better to eat and healthier for you than green bananas. And so that's important. But not only that, but you want to be able to distinguish the striped tiger from the green background. And that seems like colors and edges and all sorts of experiences are important. So that's a lot of functionality. That's important. And so if that's a first order thing, then phenomenal consciousness has a lot of value. Well, higher order theories seem not to say that, because they're going to claim that all of those first order states in principle can happen without consciousness, and they have the same, or for the most part, the same causal interactions in terms of their content. So that, the representation of the banana as a certain color is going to be just as useful to the organism whether you're conscious of it or not, according to the higher order theorists, or at least according to some higher order theorists. That's something that you can debate. And so some people have said, well, gee, if those states can occur unconsciously and they do a bunch of stuff, and being conscious of them doesn't really do much except make it be like something for you, then no function for consciousness. And that's supposed to be a problem. But this is an empirical question, whether there really is a function for consciousness. And so I want to end by just talking about two kinds of experimental findings, and these are the ones that Rosenthal talks about in our article, which sometimes people think put pressure on this issue. So first is the experiments by Ben Libet, and then there's the experiments by the Dijksterhuis et al. Laboratory. And the Libet ones are probably more well known, I think, and been around for a while. And I first heard about these when I was in San Francisco as an undergraduate, because Libet was at UCSF. And he did his experiments there way back in the 70s, of course. But I mean, people in San Francisco knew about this and talked about this well before it was sort of duplicated. And that's why this stuff got really popular, because other laboratories showed and refined this methodology. And this experimental finding turned out to be very robust. And it's not like the kind of thing where you do it once and in this weird situation, you get this weird result. But it's like if you do this consistently, you get the same result, or similar results. So what results? Well, here's the setup. And again, I should have had a picture of this, I'm realizing. But if you imagine that you're sitting at the computer screen and you have a button that your hand is sitting on, and you're watching the second hand of a clock tick around a clock. So the second hand is just sweeping out a circle, takes 60 seconds to sweep out the whole circle. So it's like a minute to go around, and you're just watching it. And your instructions are to push the button. Okay, that's all that's involved. Now, the other instruction is that you're supposed to be watching the clock and to note the position that the clock's hand is in when you make the decision to push the button. So they tell you, just sit there, don't do anything. And whenever you want, you could be here for an hour, could be here for a week, could be here for 0.05 of a second, anywhere in between. Whenever you feel like it, push the button, but also as soon as you decide to push the button, note when you did it, where the hand was. And that's very interesting. So people can do that. They push the button, they tell you where the clock's hands were. Now, the twist here is that Libet had people in his laboratory who were in for very surgical procedures. In particular, some of them were in for epilepsy, and they were having brain surgery to remove the part of the brain which was epileptic, which was spasming and randomly firing. And that's, of course, only a last resort, but some people really need that. So Libet's idea was that while they were in there, and by the way, these people have to be awake while you do the surgery, because you need to make sure that you're not slicing out a part of the brain that's really important. So you have to have them awake. You open up their head. The scalp is exposed. You have to go in with an electrode and pass electrical current through various areas of the brain. And you ask the person, like you touch the brain, and then you ask them, what'd you see, what'd you hear, what'd you think of? And you sort of map out that the areas of the brain, and you use that as a way to cut out just the area you need to and leave as much of the stuff that's important intact. So Libet's idea was, hey, look, we got these people in the laboratory. Their brain is, the skull is open, the cranium is exposed. You can get to the brain. We have to poke at it. So maybe they'll let us do some quick experiments because it's a unique situation. And in fact, they did. So what Libet did was, while they had these people doing this button pressing, looking at the clock experiments, while their skulls were open and brains were exposed, and they had an electrode in their brain, which was recording. And so they were getting recordings directly from the cortex, not from the scalp, directly from it. And in particular, the motor cortex, which is right at the top of the head. So it's easily exposed by just removing the top of the skull, or even just a patch of it. So they have the electrode there, and basically the physiology of the motor cortex, that's the area which sends the signals out, which make movements. And the basic idea was that you wanted to measure the activity of that area and look for the activity which was the beginning of the button ultimately getting pressed, because the finger has got to be moved. The signal comes from the brain. That signal originates in the motor cortex. So Libet's idea was to look at that signal, and there's some components of it that are fairly well studied. And you could, they have some data from animals where they can do this, and they don't have to ask their permission. They ask other people's permission. And you stick the electrode in the monkey, and you train it to press buttons like this, and then so you can look at what the brain activity. And so there's a certain thing called a readiness potential, which is important for when the activity, it indicates that the action potentials, the signal which is going to move the finger, is being generated. So that's called the readiness potential. And it occurs a certain time before the actual signal is generated. Now, all of that is fantastic and very interesting, but here's the twist to all of this. So subjects would report that they made the decision at a certain time, call that time T. But what Libet found was that the readiness potential was occurring consistently before T. So in other words, and so you say, well, what does that mean? Well, what that means is that the subjects reported that they were pressing the button at this particular time, or excuse me, that they had decided to press the button, that they made the decision that they were intending to press the button at that particular time. But the brain was already preparing to send the signal to press the button before the subject says that they decided to press the button. So what's going on here? Well, Libet thought that this had some implications for freedom of the will and the way that this stuff works. And some other scientists think that as well, that if, that maybe conscious decisions don't have any much role to play in generating our actions. Maybe it's unconscious decisions. And maybe the lag here, this is where Rosenthal's interpretation comes in. Maybe the lag between the subject's report and when the thing is actually coming, maybe the readiness potential is something like the actual mental intention to press the button, and then later is the awareness of that intention, so it becomes conscious. And that's when you experience yourself as making the decision, even if it was unconsciously made a few seconds before. So now that's a controversial interpretation, and people have, interpreting Libet experiments and Libet style experiments has become a cottage industry, as we say, which means a lot of people write stuff about it. And this isn't the only way to interpret this stuff, but if this is a coherent and consistent way to interpret, then it looks like we have some empirical evidence that consciousness doesn't add much or play much of a role in making these kinds of, it's all doing it unconsciously, and then we become aware of it, and that's sort of exciting for us, but the decision was already made. So people like Rosenthal will put weight on this and say, look, this is empirical evidence that consciousness doesn't have any function. So what looks like a disadvantage turns into an advantage. You say, look, your theory can't explain how consciousness has any function. And then Rosenthal counters, but look, science is kind of suggesting that maybe it doesn't have any function. So that's a point in my favor and against you. Um, uh, Now it's a complex issue, but it's an interesting argument. Okay, and then finally, I'll appeal to just one other thing. Again, this is from the Rosenthal paper. This is the work of a laboratory run by a guy named Ab Dijksterhuis. And this work is controversial, don't get me wrong, but it's interesting, and it has been slowly being reduplicated. So I think there's at least one other lab that duplicated these findings. But so whether it's right or wrong, it illustrates how this isn't merely a conceptual issue, but really is an empirical issue, whether consciousness has function. So a lot of people think rationality is important for planning and inference and so forth, and that consciousness is involved with that. So what these guys did is try to test that. And what they do is they have people make relatively simple decisions, like which pair of socks that you should get as between a couple of various socks, versus more complicated decisions like what kind of mortgage to get on a house or interest rates on a loan. And they have so they have those two conditions, simple decision, complex decision. And then they have two other variations, the conscious variation and the unconscious variation. So in one case, people are given lots of time to think and compare and look and plan and make inferences and so forth. And in the other case, they just have to make the snap decision. Pick one now. Now, if you sort of think that consciousness is going to play a big role here, the hypothesis should be that it doesn't really make a difference for the simple problems, right? Whether you do it quickly or consciously think about it and so forth. But for the complicated ones, like which mortgage and so forth, you would expect a big difference here. You would expect that the people who have to do it sort of quickly or do it while attending to something else or largely unconsciously or whatever, that they would make worse decisions, that they would make worse decisions than the people who have time to sit down and think about it. That seems to be what the prediction would be. And what the results seem to show, or what they suggest, or one interpretation of them, and you can go and look at this stuff if you want. I think he's at NYU Medical School now, but the lab has produced a lot of work. And there's a lot of controversy about it, as I said, but it's interesting that it brings up these issues. So the basic finding is that in the complex cases, people make better decisions when largely unconscious processes are driving the decision process. And that actually the consciousness of or thinking about their decision tends to make it worse. That they choose the worst mortgage, the worst payment plan, etc. Whereas in the other case, the unconscious case, they choose overall better ones that are more rational, better interest plans where you pay less over time, etc. So that's interesting because it seems to suggest, and some people have taken it to suggest, that consciousness doesn't add anything. In fact, it may interfere a little bit. It may mess stuff up. And maybe you've had this kind of experience in your own life. I don't know. I think I have maybe, where you are trying to do something and you're doing it okay. For me, it's like playing music. You're playing it and it's going all right. And then you start noticing that you're playing it and you start thinking, yeah, gee, look what I'm doing. This is pretty fantastic. And then suddenly you mess up. You lose your place because you weren't just doing it anymore in a largely automatic manner, but you started focusing and thinking about what you're doing. And maybe that messes you up. Now, that's just an anecdote, but I think it fits well with this kind of Dijksterhuis stuff. And I think that this is an important challenge. Now, again, none of this demonstrates or proves anything. The point is not to prove that higher order theories are right and first order theories are wrong. The point is to point out the challenges. So to sum up then, on the one hand, first order theories capture an important point that intentionality seems important to consciousness. But they have a hard time dealing with unconscious perception, which seems pretty well established in my view. Higher order theories handle that fairly well. They account for subjective character, phenomenal character in terms of higher order intentionality. They don't have a problem with change blindness. It points to a resilience and an actual really close link between higher order awareness and phenomenology. So they rather than being refuted by those views, I think that kind of thinking about change blindness strengthens this kind of stuff. Not only that, it seems like intentionality plays at least some kind of important role because acquiring concepts, wine and dental fear seem to suggest that at the very least, intentionality is important and changes phenomenal experience. And whether that proves that that's all there is to it, of course, I don't know. People like Block are going to say, yes, of course, I allow that it adds to it. Hearing it as from the left is different from hearing it as to the right. But he's going to claim that those intentional properties are not essential to the phenomenalness of it. Whereas the higher order theory wants to say, look, if you're not aware of it, then how does it even make sense to say that it's conscious, there's something that it's like for you? If you deny adamantly that there's nothing there, then why isn't that good enough? Now, finally, people say, well, what about function? If it's just a higher order awareness, then it looks like it's not doing very much. And then that turns into an empirical issue. Questions from Libet and Dijksterhuis become relevant. And we want to know, well, okay, when you have people do stuff unconsciously, like tasks and so forth, are they as good as when they do it consciously? And so people are starting to do this kind of empirical work. So to a large extent, I think the issue of intentionality and whether consciousness is reducible to it are going to ultimately rely on crucial empirical discoveries as premises. And so I think it's very interesting time. People are doing some very interesting research on this. Okay, so that concludes this lecture. Next week, we'll turn to the question of where do we fit this stuff into nature? And of course, intentionality, whether it's related to consciousness or not, has often thought to be super mysterious and possibly not part of physical reality. And so Descartes certainly thought that, and we'll turn to discussing him next week. Looking forward to the discussion.